Are you prepared? Prepared for what? Well, it could be something small, or it could be something larger that has an impact on your life in the day-to-day, week-to-week, or even month-to-month. And that is the subject at the heart of a new book by Mike Glover. He is a former Green Beret and owner of Fieldcraft Survival. The new book is called Prepared, a manual for surviving worst-case scenarios. Mike, thank you so much for the time. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So what was your goal with this book, Prepared?
Yeah, I think the goal was to really expose the broader audience of this idea of preparedness. I think preparedness, it might be considered like an extreme or tinfoil hat idea, but I wanted to entertain the idea to people generally and go, no matter what walk of life you are, the worst case scenario is an equal opportunist. It doesn't care who you are. And so if you read the book, I hope that people will go, oh, this isn't crazy. I could actually do some of these things. And I'm interested in this idea of being prepared.
Obviously, with what you've done throughout your life, it's required you to get better at being prepared. As a Green Beret, as a former CIA contractor, are you somebody growing up, though, who was naturally pretty prepared for a variety of situations?
Yeah, I would say so. I grew up in a military family. My dad was in the Army. My uncle was in the Navy. I think preparedness was kind of our lifestyle. And we see that often people who are prepared, they grow up with it in their household. So yeah, certainly my childhood experience lent itself to this idea of kind of thinking about being prepared and definitely helped me out, especially in a military transition.
Yeah, and speaking of and laying out what the book is all about, you talk about the preparedness matrix. There's two parts of modern preparedness: the mental or internal intangible element of things, and then also the external or physical tangible part of things. How did these two elements really come together to literally help save your life in Iraq in 2006?
Yeah, man, I've had a lot of instances of these concepts helping me. A lot of people, when they think about preparedness, they think of, I don't know, being naked and afraid in the woods, right? The Discovery Channel made that very popular. So we don't often think about preparedness being a mindset or resilience or situational awareness. So the experience that I had in 2006 in Iraq, this particular case was a hostage rescue where things kind of went bad. I mean, normally they go really well, but things really went bad because a lot of bad guys showed up. And when I think about my survival, kind of through the remembering that story, what I came away with was it wasn't just any one thing. It was the collective. It was everything at once, right? It was my mindset. It was my resilience built through adversity, through training, through prior experiences in combat. And then it was certainly my technical skill sets. It was, hey, these little individual things that I was efficient at, I didn't have to think about, so it didn't bog me down. So I was able to kind of operate through this condition of stress, doing these technical things that eventually kind of saved us. The Air Force is who saved us. But all of these things came to bear. And I think that's what people have to understand about the worst case scenario. It is a culmination of your worst day. It doesn't have to be in a combat operation in Iraq. It could be the vehicle accident. It could be the accident that takes place and you never realized or prepared for it, but it happens. And that's often people experience. And we just don't want you to be a victim and hopefully you survive and then try to figure it out. We want to be proactive, give you the tools that are necessary, mindset and the tangible skill sets, and then make you overall prepared for that worst case scenario.
You just touched on the four elements that make up the mental side of preparation: resilient mindset, proper planning, situational awareness, and then also good decision making. And chapter 1 is on the resilient mindset. Before we get into the idea of resiliency, Mike, what exactly is the mindset?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. If most people you asked who even specialized in the warrior mindset in quotations, they wouldn't be able to articulate kind of the tangible meaning of that. Or, yeah, you're telling me that, but how do I actually do that? So when we mean mindset, I literally mean resilience is your mindset, because mindset is your ability to get up off your back after you've been knocked down, figuratively or literally. but also your mindset is something that you could hone and build every day by exposing yourself to different stressors. Most people look at stressors as bad things. I look at stressors as opportunities and building adversity, building resilience. And so when I say mindset, what I do mean is building your resilience in your mindset to physically or, intangibly get up off your butt and do something about it when you've been knocked down.
Yeah, the ideal of resilience is a fascinating one. And I think it's one that I pay more attention to right now because I have an 8 and 6-year-old at home, and we are in the middle of a resiliency crisis where a lot of people in general, but kids especially, are essentially being taught to acknowledge your emotions, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but that becomes all that you pay attention to. And you don't start to focus on the part of using whatever it is that caused you to feel a certain way to help fuel you going forward. Do you see resilience as something that's in a bit of a crisis mode right now with young people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the statistics will tell you, including teen suicide, which is at record highs, that we are very complacent as a society, especially our youth. I mean, the lack of purpose, the lack of motivation and drive. There's a whole bunch of factors, but certainly the integration and saturation of technology is a huge factor. So when we grew up, like, we were outside, outdoors, getting a lot of vitamin D. We were exposed to challenges and adversity. I was surviving from garden hose to garden hose in neighborhood houses, And so when you look at teenagers now, certainly they need to be exposed to new challenges that aren't virtual in structure. They need to be in intangible worlds where they could feel pressure. They could expose themselves to pressures and then overcome those things. And so we tell people like, hey, man, this isn't difficult to implement in your life. It's like, put the cell phone down, get outside, do things that are challenging, do things that are fun and exciting. And those things without the technology are going to build resilience in yourself and your family. It's an easy start point to, I think a lot of people are like, no, well, I'm never going to be in combat. It's like, that's not what we're talking about. Have you ever done a workout of the day? Well, try that, because that's the start point, because that start point of resilience starts when your mind tells your body, oh, this isn't good because this feels bad. Stop. And most people stop. But when you hit that wall and you practice building that resilience and working through it in your head, you get all the benefits and chemicals and processes on the back end of it. And you go, man, I overcame a lot there. It's like Mick Raven's idea of like making your bed. It's sometimes that easy. It's sometimes that doesn't have to be that difficult.
Yeah, and a lot of people are reluctant to become more resilient because that involves a level of failure too. But you talk to any successful person and they'll tell you one of the keys to get to the point that they were was not just failing, but often failing repeatedly and learning the necessary lessons to go forward with.
Yeah, we often say in the military, especially in the Green Berets, is we plan to fail. We
Yeah.
don't plan to succeed. What we mean is we plan to fail when we produce and course of action development contingencies to back us up. So really, there's no point we will ever fail, but we have a mindset that failure is just part of growth. I mean, if you look at trauma, stress, most people look at the two and they go, man, that those are very difficult and bad things that we want to avoid. Except, how do you take on stress? Most people are in fight or flight in a traffic accident or back-to-back traffic in LA, smashing their head off the steering wheel because they're not prepared and conditioned for that type of stressor. So if you're not prepared for low-grade stress, how are you going to react and respond to things that actually are going to cost you potentially your life or, life, limb, or eyesight? So we have to understand that and adapt that because we have it so good. We are so complacent in our world, and that's a byproduct of freedom, by the way. And that's a good thing. But when we understand that, because we have outsourced everything that we used to lean on in self-reliance to institutions, to other things, to apps, to phones, then we could go, oh, maybe we need to purposely and intently and intentionally introduce this back into our lives so we're not so complacent and we're paying attention in the world around us.
Since you did just reference flight or fight, it is a response to stressful situations, but you also brought up a concept that was completely foreign to me prior to reading Prepared. So what is the bastard sibling or fight or flight that often rears its head during extremely stressful situations?
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. It's not often discussed. A lot of expertise on this is limited, especially in peer-reviewed studies, especially in people. Remember, stress is a good thing because stress gives us indications of our environment that things could potentially go bad. Now, a lot of that is managed through our vagal or vagus nerve that is measured through our vagal tone, which is the rate of respiration, heart rate, a whole bunch of neuroscience and good stuff to understand and learn. But what we are used to is the understanding of being hyper aroused, which is in the sympathetic response or fight or flight. We hear it growing up in school, but we don't know what that looks like on the back end. You know, if we look at this Yerkes-Dodson curve of peak of performance, well, what's on the backside? What's on the backside when you cascade into oblivion? Well, the backside is called hypoarousal. It's similar to what we see in animals and faint responses called fawn responses or playing possum. Most people know what that means, except it's an autonomic or automated response that takes place sometimes without our control. So the idea is like you're hyper aroused, you're fighting and flighting. That's a good thing because if you have it harnessed and conditioned, you could survive extreme circumstances where that cortisol, that norepinephrine is helping you fight through adversity. But on the backside, there's a wall. And if you hit that wall because you know impending doom, or like you said before, you're taking on emotions and you're becoming more emotional because you're referencing a trigger and trauma for your past, then you are complicating the manner. And if you get into this phase of hypoarousal, it means you literally will quit on yourself. And this is depicted in a story I talk about in Virginia Tech, which is a tragic circumstance that happened at that college where 31 innocent people were killed. And I encourage people to read about that. It was initially talked about in Amanda Ripley's book called Unthinkable, which is a great read. But when you look at this, there is a point of diminishment in resilience that if you go on past that, you will literally quit in place. And the chemistry and the systems biologically that are in you will force that. And there's no turning back from that. Because when you're hyper-aroused, you are frozen in place. And it's not the freeze and adaptation and hyper-arousal where I'm running, I stop, and then I get ahead of myself because I'm likely not trying to be detected. It is completely different in a shift. And when we talk about resilience, I literally want you to avoid that and create as much distance from that as possible in order to survive.
Are there good tactics for somebody who hasn't necessarily reached the point of completely freezing, but they are going through something hard and that self-doubt is starting to creep in? Is there a good way for that person to snap themselves out of that mindset?
Yeah, for sure. One tactic that we use is breathing. It sounds is simple to do it, but it's not about like off-gassing CO2 to optimize oxygen. It's not about that. It's about the actual conscious thought of breathing, which takes you out of your head in this thought of impending doom and fear, and instead allows you to focus on one central thing. It's the benefit of the woo-woo magic that's in meditation and breathing and practice breathing. Also, positive affirmation, self-talk. In the book, I talk about a story in Afghanistan where we had 107 millimeter rockets crashing into our firebase. I was prepared for the gunfight because I grew up training with the gun in hand, worried about the patrol tactics. Except I wasn't prepared for a 107 millimeter mortar that sounded, a rocket that sounded like a freight train that had a kill radius of 25 yards. Like that is a very different animal. So I froze, except I self-talked myself through the situation. I gave myself positive affirmation where most people would go, hey, you're not going to make it. It's like, you will make it. You'll be okay. Take a deep breath, work through this one step at a time. And that's what I did. So self-talk and breathing are important components that can be practiced again when you're training through adversity by exposing yourself to different things.
Chapter 2, which is the second element of mental preparation, is planning. Whether you're talking about your brothers and sisters in arms, or maybe it's your family at home and considering how you might handle a given situation, what is the best way to start the contingency planning process?
A conversation. You know, most people want to write up on a whiteboard like Ranger School planning processes. We call it the 5-paragraph op order, which is situation, mission, execution, command support, and service, or service support, command, and signal. That is something that you certainly can adapt to, but it starts with course of action development. You know, we call it in the military war gaming, but a civilian who's sitting at a dinner table with their spouse could simply say, hey, honey, what would we do if this went bad? And most people would weigh on egotistical responses. Like, honey, if somebody kicked in the door, what would you do? Well, you know me, you know what I'd do. It's like, no, but actually, what would you do? What would you do if they had a firearm? Oh, well, I have a firearm. Where's your firearm? Well, oh, it's upstairs. Oh, then what would you do right now? Oh, is the door locked? You know, when we have these conversations, we're identifying deficiency and weakness in our game, making a list of those deficiencies, and then training or equipping yourself, and then rehearsing and practicing with your family is a great way to identify the fixes for the worst case scenario. And most people would think, oh, well, he's talking about the zombie apocalypse. No, I'm talking about a house fire. I'm talking about a medical emergency in your backyard. This happens all over the country. And with basic principles, basic education, you can get ahead of it by just talking about it.
And that conversation starts with putting that technology down or stopping staring at the TV screen for a few minutes. Hopefully, most families or most individuals listening right now, they do those things without those distractions around them and enjoy the conversation at hand. Now, you also say that arrogance and ignorance are foils to good planning. How's the Titanic a great example of the former?
Yeah, it's the arrogance, the ignorance that is typically emotionally driven, like we talked about. And when you look at examples like the Titanic, where it's an unsinkable ship until the cascade of all the steps leading to the tipping point start to happen, and there's no contingencies in place, there's no fixes, and thousands of people perish. This has been identified in every major catastrophe across the spectrum of catastrophes. Good example is the World Trade Center, where you had people, because they were listening to specific guidance, they had no understanding cognitively of disaster, of what was taking place and what the statistical probabilities weighed in their favor or not. They just listened to the direction and they winded up paying the ultimate sacrifice for it. But there are some cases of, you know, a military veteran who was a Vietnam veteran who communicated to everybody and made them practice and rehearse again and again. He worked for Morgan Stanley, and he saved thousands of employees from that company because he got ahead of it. He was practicing and preparing for this eventuality that he knew would happen one day. And if it didn't, it's great, but it did. And he wound up evacuating everybody. He stayed in because he didn't want to leave until the last person was there. And his executive staff decided to stay, even as he was telling them he wanted them to abandon ship and get out of the building. They wound up staying, and he perished, paying the ultimate sacrifice by trying to lead the way in preparedness. So what we tell people is like, man, there are going to be egotistical, emotional factors that play into this, where you need analytical and cognitive processes to take over. You know, we're the only primates that are advanced enough to go, oh, that's a snake. And instead of reacting and responding and then just making it a very analytical 1 and 0, oh, it's a snake. And then we stand in fear and we think about our loved ones and we think about impending doom. And then our friend says, hey, man, that's a gardener snake. There's nothing to worry about. And you're like, yeah, I knew that. It's like we need to separate the emotional side and understand to be best prepared likely involves analytical processes that don't involve a lot of emotion.
Why do you consider situational awareness both the simplest and trickiest of the mental preparation elements to talk about?
I think because now it's what we do least often. We least often pay attention to the world around us. I would ask people who are listening to this right now, when you drove to work or the last time you remember driving, what did you do? And most people would say they interfaced with their cell phone, they called, they texted, they surfed the channels on their radio, they watched a TV show, they put on their makeup, they ate a sandwich. They did everything but paid attention to driving. Now, a good example of the detriment of that, if you did that in a foreign country like Libya, which I spent a year of my life living in Libya, if you were driving a vehicle on your phone in Libya, you would die in a vehicle accident the first day. Why? Because every single person who drives with really no law and order, where you come to an intersection where you have to pay attention to the right of way, not by a traffic light that's going to dictate that for you. If you're not paying attention, you will perish. So what I say is situational awareness is a sexy way to say, pay attention. And most often we don't. So when you go into environments that you're not familiar with, pay attention and simply look for the anomaly or the spike in the pattern. And when you see the spike in pattern, you hear or sense the spike in pattern, don't grab your cell phone to record it or tell somebody about it. Have a plan to react or start initiating actions to displace from that situation if the anomaly is bad.
You give a lot of great advice on how to execute better situational awareness in an environment, scanning by grid, 5s by 25s, and also some things to look for people who may pose a threat. Why are hands and demeanor good traits to pay attention to when determining whether or not somebody else in your environment may pose that threat?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And most people don't tune into things like, demeanor. Like, what does demeanor mean? It's behavior. It's things that we assess in a snapshot, but often we don't pay attention with hands. It's called a handgun, not a foot gun, because hands do the damage. They're the things that are typically going to violently assault or attack people, and they express a lot of things. But a person with a gun in their hand is not potentially a deadly threat without the demeanor of depicting that. I mean, the cases actually in the last 6 months of law enforcement or first responders reacting and responding to these active shootings, where the Good Samaritan pulls out the gun and he's trying to be a responsible Samaritan or responsible citizen, and they see the person with the gun. Dispatch says, person with a gun meeting this description. They show up, that person has the gun. But what's their demeanor? Are they holding the gun? Are they shooting at people? Like, what's the demeanor and the factors that are present? So what I tell people is, that's the extreme case of it. Let's take a domestic dispute that happens across our country all the time, especially with all the chaos mental health wise that we're dealing with. You go into a restaurant and you see a domestic dispute. It's two people arguing and it's starting to escalate. Are you paying attention? And if you are, hands and demeanor will tell you the story. If the man, for example, his hands are at his side and he's just talking verbally, then maybe it's just a verbal confrontation. But if you see him violently poking his finger in the person's chest, then maybe that is an indication that it's potentially going to escalate. So you don't just passively observe. You have tools and tactics to deal with, hey, am I with my family? Hey, hostess, can you sit us somewhere else? Honey, maybe this isn't the restaurant for us. Let's go ahead and get out of here. Or check, please. Right? So we need to be aware that hands and demeanor will tell more of a complete story in the anomaly, right? When I'm honing in on the spike in the pattern, but also I need to have appropriate actions to displace from that circumstance. Time, distance, as many obstacles as possible, those are never going to sway you wrong. If you hear about it on the nightly news, you don't need to be there to be part of it, especially if you're with your family. Now, as a responsible citizen, the factors might change because you have the skill sets or the position to help somebody out. But if you're in a position where you're on the X, which is the crisis site, displacing is not a bad tactic, especially if you identified bad hands, bad demeanor.
On the subject of decision making, which is the fourth element of mental preparation, who is Tom Flanagan, and what has he taught you about making good decisions?
Yeah, Tom is a real good friend of mine. He's the CEO and owner of a company called Eagles and Angels that takes both former active duty military guys, uniforms, guys and gals, uniforms, and integrates them into swag, apparel, to represent a component of their career and sharing that. But also the profits are shared with nonprofits. Angels actually stands for the guys that were never coming home in combat. And he also does those things exclusively for their families with their uniforms to give them something to remember and wear and represent, and also give to nonprofits. Tom was also a former Army Ranger, an elite Tier 1 operator in the Ranger reconnaissance element of Ranger Battalion, and he was a Delta Force operator. But Tom has many experiences, and in many cases, he's taught me a lot through my military career, but in many cases, he's been in the worst case scenario where one time he was hunkered down in a safe house where it was compromised. They got in this big shootout, and the bad guys had him surrounded and were Swiss cheesing this house they were hunkered down in. He saw complete chaos, but in his situation, with the operators that he's with the Rangers that he's with, each and every moment of time, they were able to work through one small problem set at a time. And that's critical. A lot of people think they're going to rise to the occasion. You're not. you're going to fall to your level of training. And if you do so one incremental victory at a time, you are going to succeed. And so Tom's story, which is shared in the book, is a profound example of that. But these heroes, these operators and special operations that do this, they are not succeeding and coming out in the best case, but in the worst case scenario because of any one thing. It is the culmination of all the things. It is their health and wellness. It's their attention to detail and planning. It's their culture. And that's important to understand about preparedness as a civilian. If you don't have a culture, then you don't have a way of honing this as a lifestyle. You just got a hobby. And I don't want you to look at preparedness as a hobby. I want you to look at it as something that you could live as a lifestyle and integrating your family into as well. It could be fun. It could be exciting. It doesn't have to be scary.
Yeah, learning about his ideology of making the right decisions in order, it reminds me a lot of good chess strategy and what makes for the best chess players. It's not just being able to look several moves ahead. It's being able to understand that even though you're looking several moves ahead, 2 or 3 moves ahead, your opponent could do something completely different, and you understand exactly how to respond in that situation too.
Yeah, he talks about it in his examples and experiences in wrestling, where he was trying to get ahead of his headlights. And when you think about all the moves and the procedures and the tactics that you bear, often we get consumed with multitasking too much at once. Sometimes it's just taking one move at a time. It's why we encourage people, if you're not into martial arts, if you're not into jiu-jitsu, that's a good a place to start, because you learn a lot about resilience, but you learn a lot about this mental modeling and this example of working one step at a time. Because if you don't, you'll overwhelm yourself. You won't be conditioned for stress. You'll be overwhelmed by it, and then you'll start to degrade. And you could do this in practice on the mats every single day at your local Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu dojo.
Hopefully nobody is ever having to make the decision as to whether or not to use deadly force, but you do cover that in decision-making. You are somebody in your life who has had to make that decision to use deadly force. How much of a psychological toll does it take to have to make that decision, even if it's completely justified and rationalized?
Yeah, I think that's what not a lot of people talk about often in the open. I think it's an important thing to understand. Look, when you go to the range and you shoot paper and steel, when you're doing self-defense or getting very good, you have to understand there are moral and legal ramifications to all actions, even if your actions are completely justified. What I have found in teaching self-defense across the country with me and my team is when we teach people outside of the range, the range is one aspect, one technical skill set. When we're teaching people in scenario-based training, under stress, to make a decision to save their life, often we find that people don't understand what their criteria is. They know the legal response. They know the legal jargon. They say, yeah, I would use deadly force when it's appropriate, when my life or somebody that I love's life is in danger. Like, okay, we've checked that block. What I'm asking is, when would you actually use it? And what I found in doing scenarios, even talking people through different narratives of potentially using deadly force, is there's different sides of the spectrum and everything in between. You'll have a person who thinks they're justified, and legally it's not justified nor warranted. You have people that wait to the last millisecond, even to the point where it's too late. And so them on the scale is too far, too gone, too late. So we have to be able to determine under stress how we react and respond. And it only takes scenario-based training to get us there, but most people don't want to do that. So I find this idea one essential if you're thinking about carrying a pistol. I think it should be a requirement. I don't want the government requiring it. I want private institutions like advocating for it so you morally think it's required. Because what I see often is people who think they understand it, they have a bad shoot and they realize, oh, they have no idea where to begin. And that's a conversation. It has to do with neurological understanding. It has to do with moral implication, and it has to do with legal understanding of where you live in America. Because one county might vary different than the next county over in how you're going to be looked at and analyzed by a court and a jury of your peers. All of that stuff is very important because taking somebody's life is the worst case scenario. I don't want you to do it if you have to do it. I want you to work through it the proper way.
Very well said there. Now, moving on to physical preparation, why do you consider everyday carry to be at the foundation of physical preparedness?
I think, most people, when they hear everyday carry, EDC hashtag's really good, right? It markets really well because it's the cool thing. But I'm not talking about the pistol in your waistband. I'm talking about your demeanor and how you present yourself to the world. You know who's not a victim? I'm not a victim. You know why I'm not a victim? It's because I don't carry myself like a victim. I dress the part, I look the part, I play the part. So from head to toe, I think about all of those considerations, including my posture, how I present myself to other human beings around me. I'm not afraid at making eye contact. Some people would think that's intimidating, but I use that confidence barrier to bridge the gap between somebody who's identifying somebody as a victim or somebody who potentially is a liability to their actions. Most bad guys who have been surveyed, it's been done before, have said they look at somebody who is not adaptive in their environment, which means they don't belong there and they potentially look exploitable as the victim. You look weak, you will be weak, and you potentially will be exploited by somebody who's stronger than you. So it starts in demeanor, it starts in presentation, and then we work from head to toe after that. It has to do with the equipment that you carry, which is the capability you're going to bring to bear. EDC is the start point for the tangible side of preparedness.
The second element of physical preparedness has to do with mobility. I love the mobility definition that you give through Clay Croft of the Overland Adventure Series, Expedition Overland. Mobility is increasing or maintaining your ability to move. I don't necessarily have a question on that. I think that's just such a perfect summation of the idea behind mobility.
Yeah, mobility is so important to recognize because wherever you're at right now, if you're listening to me, if you're watching me, you likely have a vehicle, your vehicle in the vicinity of you, right? And we often think about it as a logistical kind of transportation thing, but it's absolutely the thing that's going to get us out of harm's way with all the extended capacity, which means more capability. So we look at vehicles as an extension of your rucksack. So if I have a rucksack, or let's use the MREs example, if I have a tourniquet in my MREs, well, what would I have in my vehicle? Well, I would have a first aid kit. And that first aid kit would be readily accessible because now I've expanded my capability in the space I have. And you don't have to have a $100,000 overland rig. You don't have to have an expensive vehicle. You can have a Honda Civic. If you have an empty trunk and you have space, you have capacity. So carry the things that you're going to need. We've seen this last year with major natural disasters. An example is a young woman who perished in her vehicle in New York, in Buffalo, that get hit with a huge snowstorm. It was a record storm, but she died in her vehicle in the middle of a neighborhood minutes from her house. So I think it was estimated to be 6 minutes from her home. You know why? She got on her phone, she FaceTimed her family, and she said, I'm going to hunker down. She stayed in her vehicle with the heater on. The snow covered her muffler, and she died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Like, the fact that happened in our country is insane to me, but it's simply because we're not paying attention and we're not understanding basics. Like, yeah, you could die of carbon monoxide poisoning, but your car is an asset. So we look at it and we call it mobility, which is just a sexy term of looking at your vehicle as a capability in the worst case scenario.
Gosh, I feel like I hear that story far too often. I used to live in Oregon, and there was an example of a family who tried to take a mountain pass that was closed for the winter, but it showed on Waze that it was the quickest route for them to get from point A to point B. They end up getting stuck in the snow, and the same exact thing happens too. It's such a seemingly common sense moment for a lot of people, but then again, to the point that you're making throughout this conversation and in this book, a lot of people don't think far enough ahead or consider the consequences of the decisions that they're making in the moment.
Yeah, it's a tragedy that common sense isn't so common nowadays, but it's just the nature of things. I mean, we've bought into the idea that technology has optimized our experience and made us more efficient. We thought that social media would make us more social, but what all these tools and efficiency are actually doing is pulling us further away from the natural environments that we operate in. So if we didn't depend on Waze, we actually understood like environmental patterns, we understood the weather, we understood the terrain because we've assessed it. and not looked at it on a application on our cell phone, we wouldn't. I mean, the analogy is like Google Maps drove me into the wall, right? It's like, well, it told me to go straight. It's like, yeah, but that's a wall. Yeah, but it said on the app to go straight. It's like, yeah, but you could just like use your vision and observe that there's a right turn and you don't have to hit the wall. That's the way that our brains are being tuned into the algorithm. And that's a detriment to our overall survival in real world catastrophes. And so I agree that like with some basic principles and understanding, that family or that girl could understand like, hey, she was within 100 feet because she was in a city neighborhood of somebody's front door. If she would have packed out the appropriate gear in her vehicle, she could have donned that gear and then walked. Or if she had a shovel or a piece of cardboard, she could have dug out the snow from back of her muffler and used her vehicle as good shelter, which is it's appropriate for, but understanding that she potentially could perish from carbon monoxide. So yeah, we need to pay more attention.
Why do Mylar blankets get some love in the chapter on mobility?
Yeah, good question. I think when people think about this idea of preparedness, they go, oh, this is going to be expensive. This is like an expensive hobby. Mylar space blankets, which have millions, I would venture to say tens of millions of dollars invested into the research and development for the space program. Except Mylar space blankets are $2.99 at any outdoor place. You can get them on fieldcraftsurvival.com, and they are good for reflection, deflection, trapping water, signal, and most importantly, maintaining your core body temperature. Not just in the worst case scenario where you are going to potentially die from a hypothermia, which, by the way, in natural disasters, mostly kill people, which is exposure to the elements. But if you have a bleed, for example, your core body temperature starts to crash to compensate. It's one of the reasons why we use IV. So you need to be able to wrap that casualty or yourself, if you are bleeding, to maintain your core body temperature. So it has important applications. It's the size of a graham cracker, and it's something you would stuff in your mobility bag on the back of your seat and fire and forget. It's there when you need it. Buy 5 of them and stuff them in a pouch from Fieldcraft.
Why is the homestead, which is the third and final element of physical preparation, what people get wrong more than just about anything else with regard to being prepared?
Most people don't look at their house or their home as their bed down and where they're going to sustain survivability in the long term. I mean, the reality is most people don't live on 5 acres off grid. They live in apartment complexes, condominiums, and suburban homes. So what I tell people is, one, that's the place you're likely to bed down, but how long can you survive? We have completely outsourced to every institution, government and private, leaning on the idea of efficiency. So your healthcare system, it's the hospital. It's not your capability at home. Your first responders and your security. It's the police officers, the EMS professionals. It's not you and your capability. And when you think about the worst case scenario, it doesn't even have to be worst case. It could be a strike on fuel or a strike on the supply chain that feeds your Walmart. Your Walmart has about a 2-week supply. And if the supply chain stops, how much equipment, how much gear, how much food and water do you have on hand to get you through a long haul? The long haul could be 72 hours, but it could also be months. And so if you look at these catastrophes and you look at your ability to sustain yourself and your family long haul, you don't have to have the 5 acres off grid. You can have a closet, an empty space, and then you can have some minor investment where you don't buy the energy drink every day. You take a few dollars and you invest in backstocking your supply of food and water and hygiene. Because like a natural disaster rips through your backyard, that's going to disrupt your water, your electricity. So having some wherewithal and some understanding of your situation environmentally and the catastrophes that are likely to happen in your backyard, then you would pay attention to those things, and your homestead would be the way that you would get through those long term. Just to invest a little bit of time and effort in this, read the chapter in its totality, and it's something that you could integrate, and it's fun. What I tell people is like, well, I don't know about this idea of homestead. I live in an apartment. Well, do you hunt? Have you ever hunted before? Do you eat meat? Well, if you do, then you need a good source of protein. the process of hunting and getting prepared for hunting and then actually hunting and then stockpiling my freezer with protein just took the self-reliance aspect, cut the umbilical cord from the institution, and now I'm not buying meat where I don't know where it came from. I'm sourcing it from my experience in hunting, and that's going to benefit your family in its totality and the entire process. That's a good start point for most people.
Is that 6-month bucket supply of MREs a good strategy for stocking food in case of emergency?
Like I like the idea of having it in my PACE plan. So a PACE plan's primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. It's the last resort effort. What I tell people is, hey, one, if you've never eaten an MRE, then you should, because you won't poop for a week, and that's not healthy for you. I mean, the amount of sodium and the amount of preservatives that are in meals ready to eat that could sustain longer shelf lives is not healthy for you. I would also ask, in the worst case scenario, you would likely want to eat what you enjoy. So what I tell people is take the MRE, make it emergency plan. That's fine. 25-year shelf life. That's fine. On the front end, take the foods that you consume, move and buy the foods that you like, and put it to the back end and consume the front end. So it's a constant cycle. When you come into my house and my cell, which is just a closed off area that is a little colder in climate that allows me to have canned and jarred foods, I have things that I enjoy to eat, but it's like a grocery store. So when I go down, I get a box and I fill up the stuff that I want for the kitchen. I go up top and then redistribute it into my cupboard and my kitchen, and then that's my setup. Then when I go to the store, I'm buying for the back end, understanding I have plenty of supply on the front end. Think that way. If it's canned, it's 3 to 5 years. If it's jarred, it's 1 to 2 years. And if it's in a box and it's full of sodium, it's 10 plus years. But you want to be consuming on the front end of things that you enjoy, because you certainly, in the worst case scenario, are not going to want to eat just exclusively MREs.
Final question, Mike. Why do you highlight the value of community so much when it comes to homestead?
Look, community is everything, especially now. Some of the highlights that we talked about have to do with the integration and disparity that it's creating in mental health across this country. About 50% of the country, according to the government, the CDC, is reporting that half the country feels alone. And that loneliness has led to despair, to depression, to anxiety, to suicide at record highs, drug overdoses at record highs. And that's important to reference, because when I see calamity and chaos in our society, I don't think those are bad instances. I think that is an indication of us putting Band-Aids on axe wounds. The axe wound is the disparity and breakdown of the family unit. It's our inability to interoperate with each other. You see your neighbor and you scowl. It's like, who is that? It's like, honey, that's our neighbor. He's lived there for 20 years. Like, bah, right? Because we think our virtual reality is better than our actual reality. What I want people to understand is the lone wolf will never survive. It's the pack. It's the tribe that will allow you to survive. You could have about 120 members of your tribe before you start breaking down. It's been seen as high as 150. Ironically, in the military example of that's about a size of a company unit. I come from a tribe culture. What I'm trying to introduce and reintegrate in society now through Fieldcraft is the idea of tribe and building out tribes across the country. Your community is your biggest asset. Lean on each other. Go to AmericanContingency.com, go to Fieldcraft. If you don't do it through us, do it on your own. Go knock on your neighbor's door. I was just out here, my steer, one of my steers hit one of my hoses, and it broke the plumbing. I'm not a plumber. I could YouTube it, or I could call my neighbor Chase and say, hey, man, can you help me out? He's like, yeah. I was like, well, what do you want for it? He's like, I want nothing. You're my neighbor. Like, you come save me when I need help. Like, no. I'll give you some meat. I just harvested an animal. I'll give you some meat. So I gave him a box of meat. I'm bartering. I'm building relationships. And now I know who to lean on in the worst case scenario. Community is what it's all about. Start building relationships, and it starts with you and your family. I promise you.
Great way to end this conversation. He is Mike Glover. The new book is Prepared, a manual for surviving worst case scenarios. Mike, thank you so much for the time today, and thank you for this book.
It was an honor. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everybody who listened to me run my mouth for so long about a topic I'm obviously passionate about: preparedness. Thank you so much.
Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. And thanks to you for hanging out. For more of the show and to connect on social media, visit booksonpod.com. We'll talk to you next time on Books on Pod.